the conch, right? Is that
Conch shell, yeah.
musical instrument or
Yeah.
signaling device or something?
Actually, both. It was used for signaling and musical instruments.
Ain't they beautiful?
Ceremony, yeah.
Yeah.
It's about 3 pounds of meat
Wow.
in one about that size.
Not really.
Yeah, and these days, you don't really get them that large anymore.
Welcome. Welcome very much to Conversation, where it's a pleasure to welcome to the program two gentlemen. We're going to talk about the Taíno Indian peoples here in the New World, and particularly in the Caribbean Basin, but we're going to talk also about the indigenous population of what was to become the Americas, and the situation that should be kept in mind as we think historically and so forth. And I'd like to introduce the guests and get into a conversation. We have some things to demonstrate and a couple of tapes that we're going to do some roll-in of music and so forth. But if I may, on my far left is Roger Hernandez, and his name is one that I have difficulty pronouncing, and most would, but I'll do my best and you do it right, okay, Roger? But it's Atawiba Chase.
Very close. It's Atawiban Sesh.
Yeah, Atawiban Shesh. Okay. And is that Taíno?
Yes, that's a Taíno
That's
word.
a Taíno word and name. Does it have a literal name or meaning?
Yes, it does.
What does it, if you may?
I'd like to share with everybody here today. It's mountain wind, Atawiban Sesh. It's actually two words put together
Yeah.
In a manner of our language, and it means mountain wind. Atawi, meaning mountain, and Bansesh, meaning wind.
Beautiful. Yeah, it is beautiful. It's my fault for not having been. Anyway, Roger, welcome very much. Hernandez, welcome very, very much to the program. And on my immediate left is Roberto Múcaro Borrero, and he is also a cousin. I think you guys are cousins, right? And you're both associated with the United Confederation of Taíno People.
Right.
Yes.
And welcome, gentlemen, very, very much to Conversation.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, it's nice. We visited with you. We had a thing over at the indigenous population of the UN a while ago, and you do have a long-running, I guess, or a considerably long-running program on the Taíno or on the indigenous people of the Americas.
Peoples,
but
yeah.
Maybe you could share a little of your own background, and then we could get into this large subject.
Sure. Well, I host a radio show on WBAI 99.5 here in New York, called Circle of Red Nations, and that airs every Monday night from 9 p.m. to 10 p.m. And basically what we do on the show, myself and my co-host, Raven, we talk about issues, contemporary, traditional, all focusing on the indigenous or the native peoples of this hemisphere. We call it, a lot of people may say American Indian, Native American. Yeah. We like to think that American Indians, and this is the way we really try to promote it, that the indigenous peoples of the Americas or the native peoples of the Americas extended all the way from the top of Alaska all the way down to the tip of South America. So all those people being natives of the Americas would be considered American Indians. And that's what we could try to promote. So sometimes we may talk to someone right here at the Shinnecock Reservation on Long Island, or we could talk to somebody as far away as Alaska or South America, Mexico. We do interviews over the phone. Sometimes we do pre-recorded taped interviews. And we also play some music, contemporary and traditional, because we like to also have people aware that Native people are not just, or shouldn't be considered just in a historical sense, but also in a contemporary sense as well, meaning that we have lives today, and although we might not dress and live the same way our ancestors did 500 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, or 40,000 years ago, we still come from that heritage. They are still a part of our ancestry, and we're also part of this world as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a real rich tradition, because when you think about it, the mitochondrial DNA shows us now that all of our species, Homo sapiens sapien, we all originate from Africa. We're all out of Africa.
What's now known as Africa today.
What is now known as Africa,
right.
You're right.
Because there was no Africa back then.
But if you think about it, the migration outward from that original homeland, the people who went the furthest were the people that were to become the indigenous people of what was the pristine Americas. And so that was a heck of a trek. The people in Brazil had gone 95% of the way around the world.
Yeah.
And they're migrating.
I think it's also important, like, if I may just, there's also that, I mean, we can think about life and everything from the scientific sense, you know, and from the DNA, and I know that all this science has also made very, I mean, incredible advances over the last few years.
It is,
and it just keeps going. But then again, the native peoples themselves, no matter what continent they're from, if they are from Africa or Asia or from the Americas, a lot of the traditional stories from certain groups talk about them always being in a certain
Oh, I
area
see,
too,
right,
you know.
yeah, yeah.
And I think it's just important that also is because when you think about it, it makes sense in a way because the people now they're starting to say, the archaeologists, right? You know that, oh, people were here from maybe 10,000 years ago.
Oh, certainly.
12,000 years
Clovis,
ago.
man, yeah,
Clovis, and
yeah,
then now
sure,
they
sure.
were even
The
talking
Nin.
about, right?
Yeah.
Even before that now, a little they found some earlier than Clovis in South America.
Oh, that's 40,000
right,
years.
exactly.
Yeah.
So you see that every year or every few years there's a new discovery on how long. So that just goes to show that even if there was these migrations, that people have been in this hemisphere for so long that there's no remembrance of that travel.
Well,
And
40,000
you know,
years. If that's the case,
so
that's a long time.
that's a very long
And
time.
but there are no evidence at all of any proto-man in the New World. There's no Australopithecine or anything.
Yeah,
so the first people who came here, and they came in waves apparently, maybe 3 waves.
Waves.
That people came, and the people who came here were fully developed Homo sapiens sapiens. There was no proto-hominoids or anything to be found in the Americas anywhere.
Not yet, and what I think is interesting because look at all the construction and the development that goes on, right?
Yes.
I mean, you never know if there was an archaeological site that might have answered the question that has a mall over it right now.
Well, maybe,
You know, we don't
anyway,
know.
and it's also interesting, isn't it, too? And Rod, you jump in anytime and everything, but it's also interesting that when we were talking about indigenous peoples, you're talking about people that are indigenous to an area. We were chatting before we went on the air, that when you look at the whole world, I mean, the Americas, which is such a vast, that's about 1/6 the world landmass or something, a vast area, maybe somewhere between 40 to 100 million people were here before Columbus came, a vast expanse, and that those people elsewhere where the Europeans had their mark or the migration, it's only in the Americas, maybe in Australia, where the Aboriginal peoples have not been able to generate enough force to make the people go back to where they came from,
right?
In a certain sense, you know.
Yeah.
So that dialectic has a particular meaning here in the Americas, huh?
You want to comment on that, Roger?
Well, I don't know. I guess that for a great many people throughout history, they actually targeted the Americas as a place to go anyway. So, notwithstanding any, any tremendous army that would be able to protect the shores of this great expanse of a continent that we had, there's always been intense pressure to come into America. So for the Indians, especially along the coast that made first contact, second contact, and third contact, has been a tremendous amount of pressure on them.
Absolutely.
And so, you know, you have the first 200 years of America's history right here, which were primarily focused on my people in the Caribbean, the Taíno people.
Right.
You had the Spanish conquest.
Sure.
And, you know, it was a lot of, just a tremendous amount of force that was exerted by the Spanish.
Horrible.
And the most treacherous and horrible way that you can imagine.
Yeah.
You know, for straight 200 years before anybody really concerned themselves with, how to make the transition more just.
Yeah, right.
So,
oh, yeah. Well, there might have been a few, Bartolomeo de las Casas and a few, but that encomienda and that system that they had in the early stages was really, it could be, I think it would only be called a racist Holocaust. I don't see what else one could call it. You know, it was a horror.
It was a Holocaust. I mean, it was ethnocide, an attempt at a total genocide of a culture and of a people, because once again, you know, you had a different ideology coming over. You have to remember that the Europeans were coming out of the Inquisition when they came over here, and they were already doing that to their own people in Spain, and they were excommunicating hundreds of thousands of Jews when Columbus left.
Absolutely. They had expelled them in 1492.
They were involved, they were involved in a 900-year war with who they call Moors, were people coming from the north coast of Africa, and which is very close to where Italy and Spain actually is Portugal, you know. And so that whole conflict was going. So they were already a warring culture.
Yeah, expansive,
I mean, you know, and they were used to that colonization, and a lot of the same tortures that they used against the Moors, against the Jews, against different peoples, that just input that whole ideology and philosophy here in the Americas, and it was very easy because since the Bible or the talk of, they were talking of just like what they did in the Crusades, you know, bringing the Bible over to the heathens. And this is the way that they had the right. It was like a manifest destiny of terra nullius, what they call it, empty lands, and meaning that the people that were here were not even people.
Yeah, they had
were
that.
not real
They had
souls.
that question. They had,
Right.
are they really?
Yeah, and
Homo
they had
sapien?
great arguments about that. And when you really look at it, I mean, according to the way I've heard the Bible expressed, or people talking about, you know, what were the philosophies of Jesus, I mean, the people in the hemisphere, at least I know my own ancestors were living in that way. Yeah, because at least in the Caribbean, it was a little different from maybe a place in the north, like in Alaska or in the Arctic Circle, because the Caribbean has a year-round growing season.
That's right.
The fishing from the islands themselves,
Gorgeous.
the interchange, so the people had a lot of time to develop themselves because they weren't as pressured for food or for hunting. There was no large predatory animals on the land itself, except out in the sea where you have sharks and stuff like that. So it developed a whole lifestyle where the people were just naturally very generous because their land was very abundant, you know. And so that was the philosophy that they greeted Columbus with, and he used this to his advantage.
Particularly on what was San Salvador,
San Salvador,
Guanajuato, or what was that?
Guanahani.
Guanahani, right?
Yes.
That island, and they were there, and he had
Yes.
it in the journal. He said, "These people are so peaceful and loving and beautiful and sweet, and it would be very easy to enslave them."
Yeah, and
they were
he was right
generous.
Away,
of
he was
nature,
right away
so
sizing us
so
up for slavery, and that, I mean, I think that needs to be said, that, you know, Columbus was the first transatlantic slave trader in the hemisphere. He started it when he came to what's now called the Dominican Republic in Haiti today.
Yeah, that's where
he
they
named
focused.
it Hispaniola.
Yeah.
I mean, they took people out of there to bring them back to Spain, to parade them around the Spanish court, to show the exotic people who they were. And, you know, a lot of people don't say, oh, well, it wasn't really Columbus, but he was actually the first one who brought slaves and
he
took
brought
them
back to Barcelona when he met with the royal court
to
in
show
Barcelona
them, to parade
in
them.
93.
Many of those people died along the way because he didn't even give them blankets. And, of course, in the Caribbean, you have a year-round temperature of about 85 degrees. So the people didn't really need to wear anything, and they're going to a place like Iberia, Spain, which is colder, different climate, long sea voyage. I mean, they were sea travelers, but not like that, you know.
Yeah, it's a thing. It might be, if it could, just spell out a couple of those things against the whole sweep of human history, because we now have the human history begins 200,000 years ago, and we do come out of that. And if you think about it, they start in Africa, and then they migrated all the way to the eastward, and then, but to the westward, they had moved hardly any degrees of longitude at all. There was some rumor of Carthaginian crossings of the Atlantic, and there's that in the, you know, they came before Columbus, and certainly the Vikings came from Europe. But by and large, that westward movement, they'd gone 95% of the way around the world in an eastward migratory pattern. I mean, the people that became in the New World, you know, in the Pleistocene, but then they hadn't gone hardly any distance at all westward. That Atlantic had held that up until, in a back and forth kind of way, until 1492 when Columbus made that voyage.
Well, they're also looking into that as well, because Thor Heyler, though, had a whole idea of the people from the islands of Hawaii and even as far as the Polynesians, that they actually came from what would be considered the east from them, which is the Pacific side of South America. And so they went about to prove how could someone travel from South America to Polynesia on reed boats, and that was, of course, a very novel idea that they actually filmed during the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, they were actually able to do that.
Yeah. And it's well known that, the people from that area, as well as many other areas of the New Americas, traveling in reed boats. These are boats that are not made out of wood, but actually like straw fibers that encapsulate air in them.
You can find those all the way up in Bolivia and Peru and Lake Titicaca.
I've seen them in Mexico.
I had seen to Roger, we had a cup of coffee one day, and I said I did my doctoral dissertation on the Aymara Indian peoples of Titicaca. That was a cultural hearth where they had discovered the potato. We've had 4 made food complexes: wheat and barley, rice, maize, and the potato was a 4th, where they went through from a Paleolithic hunting people to agriculture and then to high civilization. And 200 BC, they had a civilization, art and architecture that rivaled anything in the old world there in Lake Titicaca. So that was a real cultural hearth.
Maize, by the way, is a Taino word. It comes from the word
really?
maíz, maízi.
Yeah.
And instead of, you know how sometimes they invert the S to a Z when they translate some things in English. So it was actually maízi, maíz, and that's where they get maize.
Yeah,
you see.
I'll be darned. I didn't realize that.
There's many
Yeah.
words like that in Spanish and English that you get from the Taino language because we were the first encountered.
That's what I wanted to try and get straight if I could. Now, because we had this, and we had estimates of 40 million, perhaps 45 million, but the vast majority of the population in what was the Americas were in what is now Mesoamerica or in South America.
This is what
you had the
this is what they
Tupis,
say,
in Brazil, and then you had the precursors, and then the Aztec Empire in Peru, and then you had the Mayan and the Olmec and the others that were in there. So, but they had about 1.5 million, maybe in what is now North America. We had these you had maybe 1,000 different languages. It speaks a tremendous period of geographic isolation where these very great, rich variety of languages developed. And then we had these various stages that were there. Now the Taino, were they Arawak? Were they the people, or how do we fit in it? We have the Arawak and the Carib. We had the people in the Caribbean area. Maybe you could share a little bit of the Taino, where the Taino fits in terms of the overall, outreach of the indigenous people.
That's a good question. That's a very good question, and I'd like for Robert to answer that because it's a.
First of all, we have to remember that when a lot of language groups are identified by anthropologists and archaeologists, they have to come up with a major term to describe people. So today when people talk about people out in the Western Plains, they may call them a Siouan language, meaning from the Sioux. But Sioux, the word Sioux, was never really the word that the people call themselves because Sioux came from a French word.
Lakota.
Right, Lakota, Nakota, Dakota, right, all those peoples, and that's in their own language.
Right.
For the Taino as well, there's been many books and many writers who said that the Tainos were Arawaks, and they even write Arawaks in Jamaica, Arawak in Boriken, which is now Puerto Rico today. But each one of those peoples on each of those islands spoke a main language, a root language, and Las Casas, Bartolomé de las Casas,
he was
that you spoke,
tremendous scholar.
he even wrote down that since he was there in the very first days
of with Columbus,
that he wrote down that in all the islands there's like a common language, and that the people were able to communicate with themselves. And that so when the anthropologists were understanding that and trying to figure out how the origins or how the travels or the population movements went around, they had to describe people, and they used certain cultural cultural ways of life and language to describe and identify different people. And the closest people that they found to the Taino and to the Taino language were people in what is now known as Guyana and Suriname today. And they call those people Arawaks. But Arawak, interestingly enough, I've been to Guyana and I've met many people who are quote-unquote called Arawak, but that's like calling them Sioux or a Navajo. Navajo is not a real word either. It's a Spanish word used to describe the Diné people.
Diné,
right? But the Spanish called them Navajo.
Culture, right. That's a unique language group.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
And so our language as well, in each of the islands, the people had different names from this, but they were able to communicate through a common language. And this language would vary in dialects as, the farther up you would go. And so the Arawaks, the people who are called Arawaks, they're not even really traditionally don't call themselves Arawaks. They're called Lokono. But they've been called Arawaks for so long that now they're just comfortable.
Lokono.
Lokono, yes.
The Lucayan, Lokono.
It's different from Lucayan, which was up in the Bahamas.
And that was where the people, were they of the Taino?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
They spoke the similar language, the similar customs, but since those islands were smaller, they had regional dialects and a regional uniqueness to them as well.
San Salvador is about the size of Manhattan.
Right. So when you get to larger
thousands of tiny little islands.
Yeah, all throughout
but
there.
I mean San Salvador where Columbus landed. About the size of Manhattan.
So all those people were going back and forth, via canoe, and they were trading and they were fishing. And so as you go down the island chain from the Greater Antilles, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and you go down all the way down, you follow Martinique, Dominica, St. Lucia, all the way down to Trinidad, right before you reach the South American coast. All those peoples were able to communicate with each other.
Really?
But Arawak
they could
is not a
communicate
real
in a similar language,
right?
like a
and it's
lingua
called
franca.
Arawak today.
Were there
it's
dialects or something?
There were many dialects, and this is why you have some regional difference. Why some people were called Caribs, and I think that was also another a mistake by the anthropologists, because the people, the Kalina or the Caribs in Guyana and in Suriname had like a traditional, I guess, disagreements with their neighbors who are called Arawaks. And so the anthropologists kind of used that whole idea and imposed it in the Caribbeans, because they developed what was known as like the good Indian, bad Indian concept, because back then there was some outcry in the 1500s to what was going on, to the Holocaust that was going on.
de las Casas.
And so they had actually made a royal edict that said it was no longer legal to enslave Indians, good Indians, the Guaitiaos or the Taínos. But the ones who could be enslaved were the ones who were known as cannibals. Any Indian that was caught practicing cannibalism, sodomy, any kind of...
the Caribs got...
And this is what they call Carib. But when you really look at the history and you really look at the investigations and the actual proof, there's no real proof that the people who were called cannibals actually ate anybody.
Yeah, right.
You know, and this is what we like to point out, is that this is part of the myth that was used for anyone to resist.
Yeah.
Anyone who resisted, even if it was a Taíno in Puerto Rico, anyone who resisted against the Spaniards or against the colonization was known as a Carib. This way they could be enslaved and they could be taken away, and then you break down resistance like that over time.
Yeah, right. And
I mean, even today, there are people that believe that they are cannibals from the Caribbean. I mean, it's, you know, just something that's been indoctrinated.
That's the way the myth can make it.
Yeah, and actually what it does is it just focuses attention away from the real atrocities of what had occurred.
And the atrocities were on a world scale. We've had atrocities that have been, we've had the horror of the modern era and so forth, but the atrocities that was visited down by the Europeans upon the indigenous people of the Americas stands, I would say, in a class by itself.
Because it's still going on.
It's still, that's interesting, yeah, it's still going on. But the dimensions to which the population was just obliterated.
Yeah.
Whole populations of people were obliterated. It's a horror story that isn't well enough included within the overall American picture, don't you think?
I think there are a lot of big gaps in history, and I think particularly for people on this side, you know, of the United States of America, really very unknowledgeable as to the real history of the beginnings of the Americas. If you look in any kid's book, and you know, you look up October 12th, 1492, there's like a big 2-paragraph section on the discovery of the New World.
Yeah.
Other than that, the next thing in the history books is what? The Revolutionary War, 1776. So that's like a span of almost 300 years encapsulated in 2 paragraphs.
Yeah, right, yeah. Novus Munda, they called it. They called it the new moon. Well, from their perspective, from the European perspective, they had come upon something pretty new. I mean, they were stuck in that. If you think against that they had not gone. The Muslims at Constantinople had blocked their eastward movement if they wanted to try and move eastward, and they go and they come this way, and then they came, and that was completing the eastward, because we all began in Africa again. We had a line of longitude that would go up into, you know, into Europe or north or west of Europe there, and they had hardly moved to the west. And then when they did, it was the eastwardmost and the westwardmost extensions of mankind were meeting there on San Salvador when Columbus landed on October 12th.
Right, in the Bahamas. I'd like to just kind of follow up on what you were saying about the Holocaust. And of course we need to think, as Roger was saying, about the historical perspective, but I think it's also important to understand that the contemporary perspective, because when you think about it, there has been no reconciliation or in really any way. I mean, a few reservations now are economically sustainable from the casinos and things like that, but that doesn't happen on every reservation here in the United States. Now in Latin America, the situation is even worse because they didn't have the same treaty process as they did. At least the natives here dealing with the English and the Americans actually entered into treaties with the colonists.
Many of which were just ruthlessly broken.
Yeah, there hasn't really been one that's ever been, you know, acknowledged. But it was still there,
nod of the head in that direction.
And now they can at least go to court, to the Supreme Court of the United States, and say, look, this is a document between nation to nation, and as any international treaty is. And they're able to fight, and that's how, you know, a lot of American Indians here in the United States are able to get rights for their land. They're not able, they don't have to be taxed because that was part of the agreements that they made originally, and that has to be honored. In Latin America, we didn't really have those kind of treaties. You see, so there was a lot more of a total obliteration, and not only in that physical sense, but also in a mental sense as well.
Yeah, sure.
Because you also had a whole dynamic of inventing the multiracial ideology or the nationalistic. In other words, taking away your ethnicity for a national sense. Like in Puerto Rico, for example, we don't really have the opportunity to develop ourselves in an ethnic sense, whether people want to follow their African heritage or their heritage from Europe, which is Spain or wherever else they might have
Puerto
come
Rican.
with. Or our indigenous heritage. You see, you're just a blanket term, Puerto Rican. But within that, we should be allowed to explore and affirm ourselves as who we see we are, especially if we have those stories in our own family. And while there may be mixing going on, it's that kind of ideology that continues the conquest because they're still colonizing us through our minds. We rather be, for example, in...
Well, that's all. Go ahead.
Yeah,
go ahead.
For example, like in Latin America, if you have just one little drop of white blood, so to speak, quote unquote, that's your ticket out of the lowest possible class.
Yeah, it's a
you know what I mean? And you can go up in
the race class based.
Right? Oh, I'm not an Indian. You know what I mean? That's the worst thing to be because that's seen as going backwards, the poverty. You know, the least progressive of any of the races. Right?
The least progressive, and also in that sense about the world modernization.
Right.
There's a modernization process, and many of these ethnic identities are seen as part of a historical pattern that should be just gotten over.
Well, this
and,
is what they're
grow
talking
up
about
and
today.
live
We
with
went
the
to
modern
protest
world.
in Seattle, and we were talking about
savage.
Right.
Right.
We were talking about globalization. Right. That's the new buzzword, globalization. But that globalization began in 1492.
Well, it did a big part of it. You know, it's interesting. The place where he was on October 11th of 1492, Christopher Columbus, the spot where he was, that line of longitude. If you draw it up right northward, because he was about 27 nautical miles off San Salvador when he saw this light on the night of October 11th. There been some there were people, 141 feet is the highest point on San Salvador. There were fires. There were fishing peoples. And he saw this light, and where he saw that light. But that line comes right due north, comes right through the United Nations and bisects Central Park, the point where the East and the West met in a certain kind of sense. But that was a sense. I mean, there have been situations like that where you have a civilization like the Europeans were expansive. In fact, for the last 500 years, we've lived in a European era. It was Europe that colonized the world. They colonized Africa. They colonized China. They colonized all over the world, India, everywhere. It was a
British
European
Empire. The sun never set on the British Empire.
It does now. But anyway, but they did. But there was a backing away from that, particularly after the Second War. We were saying that most of those colonial experiences, they were forced in a certain sense by the geopolitical and sociological realities of the world to go back, except in the Americas and perhaps in Australia, where those colonization efforts became a permanent pattern rather than one that could be redressed.
Well, in Australia,
understand?
I mean, you got to think that today.
So you guys should be saying, "What are you doing? You go home."
Yeah, well, I mean, this is where the trouble begins.
You know what I mean?
Because then, are we trying to be separatists or whatever? But that's where I think that people
it must
have
be
to
a hard thing to walk.
Reconciliation, and there has to be some kind of retribution, recompensation, in every kind of sense. For example. With our ancestral remains, you can go throughout the Caribbean islands, throughout the United States, and the bones of our ancestors are the ones that are behind the glass cases. You don't see Ponce de Leon's bones behind a glass case. You see Taíno Indian bones, and American Indian bones. And we've been saying for a long time that for us, that's a sacrilege because we didn't bury our people when, we were also agriculturalists besides fishermen. And we didn't bury our people.
Taíno,
we didn't bury our people in caskets. We, in essence, kind of planted them back in the ground for that follow-up, for that cycle. And to take those bones out and to put them behind glass cases interrupts a process that our ancestors put into motion, and that we today, in our own minds, in this New York area or urban lifestyle
Yeah.
can't really grasp because we don't live that type of lifestyle.
Yeah.
You know, we go to the store to buy our food. We don't have to go
You
through
go
a
to the
process,
AMP,
you
don't
know.
have to- yeah, right.
Wonder where the food is coming from, where our water is coming from, how do
Yeah.
we, you know, we have to keep our water clean. And these
Yeah.
are things that our ancestors thought about all the time.
Yeah, and you
You
had
know?
and they had if I may, they had a certain kind of feel for the, you know, for want of a better term, the Mother Nature or
The
the
natural
or
world.
ecology
Total
in the
feel for
world,
that.
and they had a spiritual feeling and attachment to the world and the environment that is something that was just roughshod over in the modernization process in many people's
Every
minds.
day.
So your values, a lot of those are being picked up by people on a large scale, where they say the extension of capitalist or globalization or whatever you want to have it of materialistic values don't have any room for certain kind of spiritual values, which in the long term, as a collective society, human society, is going to have to retreat to and find. And it's from there that we might find some values that really resonate meaningfully in terms of the way we have to go on this planet. You know, there's lessons to be learned there, is what I'm saying.
We come from
Wisdom.
paradise. The
Yeah.
Caribbean is a total paradise.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. all right.
Columbus never, they could not imagine anything like that. In fact, he said that we were in Dios. We were living the Adam and Eve story. It was
Yeah.
total paradise.
Yeah.
For us, I mean, the whole thing has been totally corrupt and it's very disgusting.
Yes.
And, you know, it plays true today. I mean, we've been somewhat removed from that.
Yeah.
But deep down in the hearts of every native person, I mean,
Yeah.
they feel it.
Yeah.
You know, that's why we pray, that's why we close our eyes, and that's why...
And the people who were treated so shabbily isn't nearly a strong enough word. Both in North and South and Caribbean and in North America, they've been treated so shabbily and so
Still, I mean, look,
unjustly.
we still are fighting just the images that were made. Today you have the Cleveland Indians, you know,
Yeah.
the Washington Redskins.
Now that grates on you.
You know, of course,
It
because
does,
we're,
okay.
if anybody else, if you drew a caricature of an African person with a bone through his nose and big lips like that, they used to do it at one
They
point
did,
on
sure,
TV,
sure,
right?
yeah.
But people kind of come to the realization that that's racist.
It's racist,
you know?
yeah, right,
and they
yeah.
shouldn't do that. But yet, Indians, American Indians, are still allowed to be subjects of caricature.
But what about
to
all
be
the Hollywood
mascots,
movies,
you know,
all
Hollywood
the Western movies?
Look
They're
at
always the bad
schools.
guys and the
My-
cavalry's the
my,
good guys.
where my
and it
parents
wasn't this
live.
way at all.
Yeah.
It's the opposite of what the
Yeah.
historical reality was.
I mean, they put smallpox in the blankets. For,
Absolutely,
right?
well,
I mean,
they
that's
did.
pretty nasty.
Yeah,
You know?
no, that did.
You
It's
know.
biological
Yeah,
warfare, and
exactly.
they did. And it was the smallpox that wiped out so many. I think it was the diseases.
Yeah, the diseases.
Apart from the forced labor, the encomienda, the slavery that they
Yeah.
tried to put them, tried to do that. Many of the people of the indigenous people of the Caribbean did not set well and were not able to be. This is what De La Casas and others say, weren't able to be enslaved. They resisted at such a degree that they were eliminated and that they had to bring in
well, this is the
African
excuse.
slaves
This is
in
the
order.
excuse they use.
Okay,
Right.
you could set me
Yeah.
straight on that.
I mean, I would think that, you know, just common sense, if they figured out, if you have a people who are motivated by profit motive,
Yeah.
you know, in other words, trying to get the most
Gold.
out of this
Mercantile
area and trying
aid.
to overwork people, that you're going to try to get the most workers that you can.
Yeah.
So of course they're going to come up with any kind of story that they can get even more people. And the slave trade out of Africa, off the
Yeah.
Ivory Coast, had already begun with the Portuguese. They were already dealing in that.
Yeah.
You know, so it was a way also to say that since people were kind of feeling bad about the Indian situation, the quote-unquote Indian situation in the islands, and they were coming up with these laws to stop the slavery of the Indians before it's too late, and all the other rhetoric that was going on, they had to figure out a way that they could still extract those resources. And the gold itself in the Caribbean wasn't really
Not that much there.
going. I
Wasn't
mean,
that much, yeah.
they really needed people to work the fields,
Yeah.
animal husbandry,
Right.
and the whole thing, because really in the 1540s, by the 1530s and 40s, people were already on their way to Peru and Mexico.
Well,
You know,
15,
they were leaving the
15
Caribbean in droves.
1535 was Peru, I think, Pizarro,
Yeah,
right?
so you have the 15,
Cortez.
yeah. So
Yeah.
they were already on their way to go, and they had far much more gold in,
Yeah.
in that type of resources.
And this was a
than we had.
mercantile age where that was the means the species by which wealth was measured. They were really on the search for gold, and they were.
Yeah.
So they didn't even want to have anything to do with the Caribbean, really, except that the Caribbean was a good place, like a jumping point.
Yeah,
for
Hispaniola,
ships,
I think. Yeah.
you know, for people en route
Yeah.
coming from a long way from Europe
Yeah.
to stop in the Caribbean to
Right.
pick up people, They had a large slave trade going out of Cuba,
Yeah.
you know, which is one of the largest areas that they would import and export slaves,
Right.
quote unquote, well, people who were enslaved, you know.
Yeah.
And because it's easy to say slaves, right, but not remember that they were enslaved. You know?
They were enslaved.
Right.
Yeah, it's hard to also, that was the period, that existed in the world.
Yeah.
You know, it's hard to imagine, you know, that
It was
existed.
a big dilemma. It was a big moral dilemma for the people that were considered themselves very righteous, very Catholic, very spiritual, and the King and Queen of Spain were very spiritual people.
Yeah.
That was a big dilemma for them. That's why they invented the term of a Carib, a bad Indian. They had to differentiate between the good Indians, the Taíno Indians, which means good Indian.
Taíno were the good ones, is that it?
Taíno in our language means good.
Yeah. In your language means good?
Yeah.
Okay,
So,
that's
you know,
interesting, yeah. Okay.
It means like human being, you know,
Yeah.
like, in other words, when you have a culture, when you know you're right from wrong, you know, you're like one of the people, you're good, you know, like this is part
And
of the society.
they had a rich
you know?
spiritual tradition. Well, some of them were a little hard to understand. Some of those were, like some of the Aztec things were pretty blood-curdling. Some of the cut out the heart on the top of a pyramid kind of things. But there was a spiritual tradition which was very close to, you know, to a quasi, like a religious kind of attitude toward the world. The Mother Earth or the Spirit Earth or the Spirit thing. These were things that were very important to the culture of the
it's hard to
people.
quantify that too, Harold.
Yeah,
I mean, when you have a culture, a society that has millions of people, like the great Aztec Inca empires and the Mayans, you have developed systems of body politic to control that.
Yeah.
Whereas in the Caribbean, it may not have been so pronounced. I mean, we're talking about islands as compared to the mainland.
Yeah, and smaller population.
But
Yeah,
the
right.
spiritual level of that practice is very evident, and it's there. It's
But
just
those
the way
things
that they
remain.
practice
Those
it.
things remain in your ritual, in your.
That never leaves.
I wonder, you know, it's really interesting. But you had a tape or something, right? You have a tape, and you wanted to show a tape that you could show some things here. Maybe we could show that now. What do you think?
This is sure. This is the tape that'll be shown. Talks about some of the things we've been talking about, but expressed through our song and dance. And there's some explanations. This is part of a presentation by the Casibahagua Cultural Society.
Casibahagua?
Casibahagua.
What is
and
this?
that word comes from one of our creation stories, the Taino creation stories.
Yeah.
And that talks about the cave of the Hagua, or the Black Cave. And that's a place of emergence for the Taino people after a great flood that had covered the whole earth. Had subsided, the people were able to come out of the darkness and into the light again.
Is this got a geographical location, supposedly?
Well, somewhere they say it's somewhere, maybe in what's now known as Dominican Republic, but I think it was more of a spiritual sense.
Yeah, okay.
But talking about an actual time, because obviously even the Bible talks about a great flood once on the earth, right?
That's right, Noah.
So even our Taino stories have that. And there was two caves. There was Casibahagua and Amaya Una, which was the place of the others. So that's where we knew there was other people on the earth also. But from our people, our culture, we emerged from Casibahagua, and that's where the name of the society comes from.
And these were things that had been handed down over the generations.
Yeah, and I
was
mean,
there
they
a
were
written
about,
language in Taino?
Well,
no.
not written as we would have it like this in English.
Yeah.
But were able to communicate, and Roger knows because we've been together photographing a lot of these things, the petroglyphs, the drawing from the caves.
Right.
And there you can talk about actual events, things that happen, connections with the spirit world or with the other forces, the other energies, besides the humans, right, that the people would deal with.
It might be good for humanity as a whole to be able to get a sense of awe or a sense of association with the other aspects other than just the human element on this planet. We need that on a world scale. I mean, we need that kind of a sensibility, I think.
I think that assumes too much, Harold. I mean, that's part of your total consciousness, and, you know, quite disappointingly, we're beginning to realize some people have more consciousness than others.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you guys might have the believing it. Well, listen, let's show that film, right? Okay, we can in the studio. You set it up, and it runs about, what, 5-10 minutes or 5-7 minutes?
It's about maybe 7 minutes.
Maybe about 7 minutes. So we'll set that up, and then we'll come back. We're talking about the Caribbean and the Taino people and so forth. And if you could set that film up and run it now, then please, and then we'll be coming right back.
Thank you.
Please run the film now. Thank you.
Well, anyway, we're going to say hello to everyone. As we were so kindly introduced, we are the Casibahagua Cultural Society. society. And we're here with much humility to see the beauty, the way everything started here. And we're even more honored that one of our own elders and community leaders has come from the island of Boriken to be here with us. Hey, there you go. How many places now? Sounds like the radio. As you heard, the dances that we're going to do here represent our people, and we're very, very privileged to be here with all of you, especially in this land. And so we want to just take a moment to remember the traditional people who are here and those spirits, and thank them also for allowing us to be here and allowing everything to go so smoothly today. So we want to remember all those native peoples who used to live around these areas, because they did, and we know that. So the first piece that we're going to do is talking about what we've heard today so far is connections and balance, and our relationship with each other as human beings, as part of the creation. And part of that has to do not only with the human element, but also the animals that also inhabit this earth with us. And in the times of the stories that are handed down, we don't say mythology. We never use that terminology. We say oral tradition, because it's just something that's handed down. Mythology is something else that somebody else termed it. So we try not to use that term, because we're trying to decolonize our own minds as well, because it's hard to even deal with this everyday society and try to be just a reminiscent of something of what our ancestors were, because they're inside of us. So we're here today to honor all of that, and to hopefully bring a little happiness in your hearts with music, because the music and the dances our people knew is for healing and for many, many things, to keep the society and the pueblo, or the yucayeque, the village, strong. And this is why they did celebrations or aretos for so many days. Sometimes they would go on for a month. So, you know, some people may be tired just from this little time, but think of your ancestors, how long they would sit there for days and days doing things. So we could have a little patience, and I think everything is going beautifully so far. So this first piece honors the animal world, and it talks about a very special creature that inhabits the islands, the island of Boriken and all the other islands, and also South Central America, the Amazon. This one honors the iguana. Very special animal, because it has a direct relationship with the sun, and you see the little spines that it has on its back. And there's stories that we have that go along with the iguana as well. So this one is called the Dance of the Iguana, and basically what it's talking about is the iguanas are having a gathering, sort of like what we're doing here. And they're dancing and they're having a good time until their neighbor, who's not always so nice to them, the hawk, comes around, the guaraguao. And then they have to do what iguanas do, kind of scatter and go to wherever they're going, and they have like a camouflaging ability. So they're able to camouflage themselves, and the hawk has to fly away and then go without eating, so then they can continue with their festival again and their dance. So this is Areto Iguana, or El Baile del Iguana.
was really good. It reminded me, I said to you, we were talking off camera, you were doing the flute, right?
Yes.
And it reminded me a little bit, because I spent a couple years at Lake Titicaca, and they had, and here's a thing, let's show it.
Yeah.
This is a, can you get in on that, perhaps, Felix? You can get in a little type. This is a thing, a cassette of that kind of music. But it reminded me a little bit of the music of the Aymara in Bolivia. It had the flute, you know, it had a certain pattern and everything like that. It's got a similarity. There was a similarity between them. Well, that was really interesting, that kind of thing. Now,
It's a real Jibaro style music.
What?
It's what we call Jibaro style of music.
Jibaro.
Yeah, it's that's a very predominant Puerto Rican, Santo Domingo, Cuban style of music, which serves as like part of the foundation, along with some of the African rhythms for today's salsa.
No kidding, yeah. So it comes out. So they've incorporated that in the modern rock and roll, or the modern popular music. Yeah.
Yeah, like what he's saying is like the basic essence of that music that you heard, the basic rhythms, the use of the gourd rasp, which they call guiro today. In Taíno they would say guaje. But all those rhythms help shape, you know, the more popular music, the typical music of the regions, because all of that was taken, elements of that were taken and incorporated with the Spanish instruments like guitar, and then you have a really, you know, a different style of music emerging, and that's what the people, you know.
Maracas, that's a Taíno instrument.
That's a Taíno, yeah, really, yeah.
The guiro, the guaje, which is the Taíno word for that gourd instrument.
Well, in the Bolivian altiplano, the people are very, very much. It's pretty well maintained, the culture and everything. But they had the panpipe and everything they put in that.
Zampoña, Sico. You know, they're also. Their geography also helped them out. I mean, when you go all the way up to La Paz, it's harder to get to them than it was to get to.
Well, it was pretty much. In fact, the Quechua even could not establish themselves there because the Aymara culture. They went back 4,000, nearly 5,000 years.
Yeah, Tiwanaku.
They had gone back to Tiwanaku and pre-Tiwanaku and so forth. But anyway, that's
in the Andes of South America. I mean, that's a mountain range.
Yeah,
it was going in a boat to get
very
there.
high mountain range. You know, so
and they had the Uru people that they had to read boats on Lake Titicaca. But that was a cultural hearth. That was a place where people had gone through. They had lithic industries. They had painted the alpaca and the guanaco. They had, you know, hunting people had hunted, but they found the potato and the quinoa and the oca, and they had established a whole food base for a high civilization. But that's another. But it is, in a certain sense, the same because the question I had in mind is because we have these rich traditions. We have some of these traditions go way back, and there's pressure upon those indigenous cultures and so forth by the forces of modernization themselves, and there's a danger of losing them. Is there a danger that we're losing the languages? Are the languages being lost to the mists of history and so forth? And what is the thing that we should try and understand about how much can we maintain the richness of these cultures?
I'd like to share something that someone told me, and that was that the native languages are very expressive. I mean, the traditions of oral, the stories, everything, there's very little that was written down except in the glyphs and the graphic.
Like back in Homeric times.
Right, and so what you have is in Europe where you have written languages, they're less expressive. And so I think in the history of linguistics, the Eastern European languages are actually the most recent languages, and they're less expressive. And so, you know, it's a big concern for us. I mean,
it is. Well, Marshall McLuhan used to say, Marshall McLuhan used to say, you know, that the major metaphor for Western civilization was phonetic alphabet, and it was where you string out. You have to take A, B, C, D. You have to string it out on a long line like this. And Michener will write 8 pages in a book to describe, you know, the sun and the bird and the sea and all of these things, which, in a multi-sensory way, you would experience all at once.
I'll give you a better metaphor.
And we're going back to that now.
Jose Marti.
These ideograms are becoming more relevant. Yes. What
I'll give you a better metaphor. Jose Marti, who's a celebrated Cuban writer, said that the intelligence of the Americas could be found in a headdress.
Oh, really?
That's our metaphor. You know, this
Right.
expresses it.
Yeah.
It's got the beautiful colors, the functionalism of it.
Right.
And, you know, the symbolism of it, which is knowledge and leadership and everything else. So
quite literally, I think it's quite true. We're going now, the cybernetic thing where we're going back, and we're going to, the internet is now going to be going multimedia, and we're going back to icons, and we're going back to ideograms, or Chinese ideograms, and different kinds of things, which are pre-literate culture. And that literate culture established even ideas of what is rational. Everything has to be strung out linearly and so
This
forth.
is the important
I think we got
yeah.
lessons to learn from the traditions that you guys have been carrying on.
I think this is the
that have
importance.
immediate meaning to the modern world. Yeah.
When we first met at the United Nations,
Yeah.
because there are a lot of issues that still need to be addressed.
Yeah.
There are a lot of concerns that indigenous peoples have, not only, you know, as Taino people, but throughout the Americas and throughout the world. You
Right.
brought up Aboriginal Australians. There's also ethnic groups in Asia and Africa, tribal groups that also want to hold on to their traditions as well.
Right.
And so recently, the only kind of forum that we've had, because we've seen in our own countries, wherever we come from, we haven't really been able to progress past a certain point. So now that the world is coming up with international conventions on racism, on genocide, you know, you had the Geneva Convention, you had all these things that internationally there's becoming a kind of consciousness that's been raised through the formation and culminated with the formation of the United Nations. You know? In other words, people of the world started saying, okay, we need to really think about, you know, we had World War II, you know, we had World War I, but we really needed to think about what's happening in a global sense as people keep expanding and dealing with other people and economics and stuff like that. So within that, indigenous peoples as well are also coming to the United Nations and to that forum, international forum, to say, hey, within that mix, while you're coming up with international conventions, while we had the Agenda 21 that was made in Rio in 1992 with the Rio Earth Summit, you know, we have a very important role and a very important voice to be to add to that whole process as Native peoples, whether we've been colonized, whether we still maintain our traditions intact, or whether they've been altered because of you know, attempts at assimilation, oppression, colonization. But regardless, I just found that there's no regardless. Right? It's hard to get out of that habit.
I know. Well, it happens to everybody.
Right?
Yeah.
So regardless of all of that, you know, we still have our cultural traditions, our oral traditions, and we should be part of that process, because within that, within all these nation states that have been developed, like the United States of America, our issues as Native people have not yet been addressed by any group.
That's right.
You know, that has come in and that has taken over, or that has been, you know, now we're focusing on urban areas a lot and urbanism. But, you know, there's even, you know, many of us who live here in the city.
Sure, absolutely.
You know, and so whether we live in the city or whether we live in our traditional homelands or somewhere else, you know, we still have a lot to say about what's going on. You talk about loss of language. You know, we have MTV.
We're losing language.
We have MTV to contend with. We have the globalization and everybody trying to have like this homogeneous, identity about what's world culture. Your hip-hop culture has taken over. I mean, I remember going back to Puerto Rico as a young boy, and then coming back later in life and seeing the change. I mean, in areas where, you know, they didn't even have too many radios or some things like that.
Well, I was down there in the Army in '54. It was gorgeous. I mean, I love
amazing.
Puerto Rico, Calle and Caguas and all that.
Beautiful place, Boriken.
But
it was amazing just to see, as a young person, to see the change and how many things from New York have been imposed now on the kids in Puerto Rico instead of the opposite, you know? So all of that has to be addressed on a local level, on a national level, and on an international level. And this is why many people are coming out to say, hey, you know, we have to fight for our rights. But we're not only fighting for ourselves, because as we're losing languages, we're losing the earth. We're fighting for Mother Earth, you know? That's the main point.
Yeah, I know it is. And the thing is, we have to, instead of it just being some great big amoeba that just creeps over the whole world and just creates this homogenized Levittown kind of modernizing in the name of modernization. A lot of these traditional values, they're not just quaint, or they're not just, you know, that sort of thing.
They're not just
they are really
pizzas.
Meaningful towards finding a way in which we're going to relate as the technological systems and so forth begin to go full circle. I think there's going to be more and more appreciation of some of these traditional values, particularly some of the ones that relate ecological.
We hope so.
Appreciation and so forth, and these kind of things, that we can learn from those.
And we have to learn quick.
Yeah,
we do. We're in bad shape. I just heard on the news, you know, there was some scientists that just went up to the Inuit territory up by the North Pole, where the people they call them Eskimos, but they're actually called Inuits. And they went to the North Pole, where there's the last time they went there, you know, they know it's North Pole. There's a big block of ice. There's so many, and they went there. Now it's a puddle.
Yeah. Well, they found that. Yeah, I know.
You know,
that was
now
very
it's a puddle.
disconcerting.
So I mean,
global warming.
You know, this is
Global warming
we have
is
to
coming.
think about.
It is something, and the tradition of the feel for nature and the embeddedness or the respect for the spiritual way of life that has been intrinsic to the indigenous people here, that didn't seem to get through the skulls of a lot of the Europeans coming with their ideas of material
well, a lot of
progress. It should be learned.
Yeah, a lot of this is quite elementary too. I mean, you think of the advances in so-called technology in the last 200 years, and really what it suggested is that we've been burning a lot of fossil fuel.
Yeah.
You know, what does that create? That creates emissions that pollute the atmosphere, the air that we breathe, and it also adds to the type of greenhouse warming effect that would, you know, cause to suggest that, that the temperature of the Earth is rising so much. So you really have to think this out. I mean, for anyone today to not be able to see that connection is really quite ignorant.
More and more are, and we're going to learn from a lot of the people, the traditions that you've been trying to keep going. Now, we only got a minute or so left. Now, what about you have your program on BAI
every Monday
and
night.
there is a network of people, like I said, some of the people in the American Indian movement, Vernon Bellecourt, some of these people, Dr. Jayuya, that are trying to carry forth this kind of a thing. But it's important that there be institutions, and you're doing that, and you're doing it. Any chance you could start putting some of this programming maybe into the network here?
We would hope so.
Some of these traditions. Roger, what do you think?
I think that's an important vehicle. I mean, television, especially here in this metropolitan area, really has the ability to focus what we feel is being important to almost 30 million people. But, you know, a lot of that takes a lot of resources as well, and the timing involved in that.
Yeah.
Robert just finished the whole thing at the United Nations.
Yeah,
that
I know. It was
involved, like,
magnificent.
almost the whole summer. He's
I
the
know.
co-chair
of the Indigenous
on.
Committee, or the Committee.
And so we've been really maybe too active, and so it takes away from some of the things that we'd like to do. And so we have a lot of younger people, a lot of people that are now becoming more involved, and we'd like to share with you our phone number and a way to get in touch with us. So
we'll put that up at the end, and you have two really interesting websites that are up too. We're going to put that all up.
We put out a newsletter.
We have a newsletter that's really very excellent. Very
paraphrasing the words of Pete Seeger or Woody Guthrie, this land was your land, this land where I live. But anyway, listen, thanks a lot, Roger.
Well,
thank you very much. We're running out of time. It's a pleasure. And I thank you very much. We had picture books and things we could have gone into.
We had some artwork we wanted to share.
But we couldn't get into it all. I'm sorry, but that was really the film and so forth. And I do think it'd be good for you to get more and more of this kind of programming about the Taino and other indigenous people in the New World on into the television medium, and they would, and I wish you the best in all of that. And thank you very, very much for coming in.
Bumatun.
Bumatun? What's his name?
That means thank you in Taino.
Bumatun. Bumatun. And we thank you for viewing, Bumatun, for viewing a conversation. We'll be coming back again next week. That's it for this particular segment. Gentlemen, once again, thank you really very, very much indeed.
Thank you.
All right, we'll see you soon, everyone.
See you next week.
And these are the shells.
Yeah. Oh, that's what you want. Oh, these are are these to wear? This is
you wear on
right?
your legs
And when you dance?
Yeah. Keeps the rhythm.
That's great.